So yesterday in Matilda, we got to learn a little bit more about our main character, about Matilda. We got to learn just how smart she was, or we're beginning to see just how smart she was or is. We also got a chance to meet Miss Honey, who's Matilda's teacher. And while we don't know a ton about Miss Honey yet, she is a very important character in this book and somebody that we need to pay close attention to. So she's somebody that you should think about as I'm reading, and you should think about how does she compare to other characters from books we've read, both by Roald Dahl and from other authors. So think about how she affects Matilda, think about how the two of them interact, and think about how we can compare and contrast her with other characters that we've gotten to know this year. Uh, and here we go. We're going to read about the Trunchbull, another really important character, and that is the title of this chapter, the Trunchbull. In the interval, Miss Honey left the classroom and headed straight for the headmistress's study. She felt wildly excited. She had just met a small girl who possessed, or so it seemed to her, quite extraordinary qualities of brilliance. There had not been time yet to find out exactly how brilliant the child was, but Miss Honey had learned enough to realize that something had to be done about it as soon as possible. It would be ridiculous to leave a child like this stuck in the bottom form. That means like the lowest class, like a kindergarten. Normally, Miss Honey was terrified of the headmistress, and she kept well away from her. But at this moment, she felt ready to take on anybody. She knocked on the door in the dreaded private study. Ooh, I'm stumbling over my words. "Enter!" boomed the deep and dangerous voice of Miss Trunchbull. Miss Honey went in. Now, most head teachers are chosen because they possess a number of fine qualities. They understand children, and they have the children's best interest at heart. They are sympathetic, they are fair, and they are deeply interested in education. Miss Trunchbull possessed none of these qualities, and how she ever got her present job was a mystery. She was above all a most formidable female. She had once been a famous athlete, and even now the muscles were still clearly in evidence. You could see them in the bull neck, and the big shoulders, and the thick arms, and the swiny wrists, and the powerful legs. Looking at her, you got the feeling that this was someone who could bend iron bars and tear telephone directories in half. Her face, I'm afraid, was neither a thing of beauty nor a joy forever. She had an obstinate chin and cruel mouth and small, arrogant eyes. And as for her clothes, they were, to say the least, extremely odd. She always had on a brown cotton smock, which was pinched in around the waist, with a wide leather belt. The belt was fastened in the front with an enormous silver buckle. The massive thighs, which emerged out from the smock, were encased in a pair of extraordinary breeches, bottle green in color and made of a coarse twill. The breeches reached just below the knees, and from there on down she sported green stockings with turn-up tops, which displayed her calf muscles to perfection. On her feet she wore flat-heeled brown shoes with leather flaps. She looked, in short, more like a rather eccentric, bloodthirsty follower of stage hounds than a headmistress of a nice school for children. When Miss Honey entered the study, Miss Trunchbull was standing beside her huge desk with a look of scowling impatience on her face. "Yes, Miss Honey," she said. "What is it that you want? You're looking very flushed and flustered this morning. What's the matter with you? Have those little stinkers been flicking spitballs at you?" "No, headmistress, nothing like that." "Well, what is it then? Get on with it." "I am a busy woman." As she spoke, she reached out and poured herself a glass of water from a jug that was always on her desk. "There is a little girl in my class called Matilda Wormwood," Miss Honey began. "That's the daughter of the man who owns the Wormwood Motors in the village," Miss Trunchbull barked. She hardly ever spoke in a normal voice. She either barked or shouted. "An excellent person, Wormwood," she went on. "I was in there only yesterday. He sold me a car, almost new. Only done 10,000 miles. Previous owner was an old lady who took her out once a year at most. A terrific bargain. Yes, I liked Wormwood, a real pillar of our society. He told me The daughter was a bad lot, though. He said to watch her. He said if anything bad ever happened in the school, it was certain to be his daughter who did it. I haven't met the little brat yet, but but she'll know about it when I do. Her father said she's a real wart. Oh no, headmistress, that can't be right, Miss Honey cried. Oh yes, Miss Honey, it darn well is right. In fact, now that I come to think of it, I'll bet that it was she that put the stink bomb under my desk here first thing this morning. The place stank like a sewer. Of course it was her. I shall have her in for that. You see if I don't. What's she look like? Nasty little worm. I've discovered, Miss Honey, during my long career as a teacher, that a bad girl is far more dangerous a creature than a bad boy. What's more, they're much harder to squash. Squashing a bad girl is like trying to squash a blue bottle. You bang down on it, and the darn thing isn't there. Nasty, dirty things little girls are. Glad I never was one. Oh, but you must have been a little girl once, headmistress. Surely you were. Not for long, anyway, the Trunchbull barked, grinning. I became a woman very quickly. She com- she's completely off her rocker, Miss Honey told herself. She's Barney as a bedbug. Miss Honey stood there resolutely before the headmistress. For once she was not going to be browbeaten. I must tell you, headmistress, she said, that you are completely mistaken about Matilda putting a stink bomb under your desk. I am never mistaken, Miss Honey. But, headmistress, the child only arrived in school this morning and came straight to the classroom. Don't argue with me. For heaven's sake, woman. This little brute, Matilda, or whatever her name is, has stink bombed my study. There's no doubt about it. Thank you for suggesting it. But I didn't suggest it, headmistress. Of course you did. Now what was it that you want, Miss Honey? Why are you wasting my time? I came to talk to you about Matilda, headmistress. I have extraordinary things to report about the child. May I please tell you what happened in class just now? I suppose she set fire to your skirt or scorched your knickers, Miss Trunchbull snorted. No, no, Miss Honey cried. Matilda is a genius. At the mention of this word, Miss Trunchbull's face turned purple, and her whole body seemed to swell up like a bullfrog's. A genius, she shouted. What is this you're talking about, madam? You must be out of your mind. I have her father's word for it that the child's a gangster. Her father is wrong, headmistress. Don't be a twerp, Miss Honey. You have not met the little beast only for half an hour, and her father has known her whole life. But Miss Honey was determined to have her say, and she now began to describe some of the amazing things that Matilda had done with arithmetic. So she's learnt a few timetables by heart, has she? Miss Trunchbull barked. My dear woman, that doesn't make her a genius. That makes her a parrot. But, headmistress, she can read. So can I, Miss Trunchbull snapped. It is my opinion, Miss Honey said, that Matilda should be taken out of my form and placed immediately in the top form with the 11-year-olds. Ha! Snorted Miss Trunchbull. So you want to get rid of her, do you? So you can't handle her. So now you want to unload her on the wretched Miss Plimsoll in the top form, where she will cause even more chaos. No, no, cried Miss Honey, that is not my reason at all. Oh, yes, it is, shouted Miss Trunchbull. I can see right through your little plot, madam. And my answer is no. Matilda stays where she is, and it is up to you to see that she behaves herself. But, headmistress, please. Not another word, shouted Miss Trunchbull. And in any case, I have a rule in this school that all children remain in their own age group regardless of ability. Great Scott, I am not having a little 5-year-old sitting with the senior girls and boys in the top form. Who ever heard of such a thing? Miss Honey stood there helpless before the great red-necked giant. There was a lot more she would have liked to have said, but she knew that it was useless. She said softly, Very well, then. It's up to you, headmistress. You're darn right it's up to me, Miss Trunchbull bellowed. And don't forget, madam, that we are dealing here with a little viper who put a stink bomb under my desk. She did not do that, headmistress. Of course she did it, Miss Trunchbull boomed. And I'll tell you what. I wish to heavens I was still allowed to use the birch and belt as I did in the good old days. I'd have roasted Matilda's bottom for her so she couldn't sit down for a month. Miss Honey turned to walk out of the study feeling depressed, but by no means defeated. "I'm going to do something about this child," she told herself. "I don't know what it will be, but I shall find a way to help her in the end." So we've learned a little bit about Miss Trunchbull there, and we'll get to know her even more as this book goes on. The next chapter is titled The Parents. When Miss Honey emerged from the headmistress's study, most of the children were outside in the playground. Her first move was to go round the various teachers who taught the senior class and borrow from them a number of textbooks on algebra, geometry, French, English literature, and the like. Then she sought out Matilda and called her into the classroom. "There's no point," she said, "in you sitting in my class doing nothing while I'm teaching the rest of the form the 2 times tables and how to spell cat and rat and mouse. So during each lesson, I shall give you one of these textbooks to study. At the end of the lesson, you can come up to me with your questions, if you have any, and I shall try to help you. How does that sound?" "Thank you, Miss Honey," Matilda said. "That sounds fine." "I am sure," Miss Honey said, "that we'll be able to get you moved into a much higher form later on, but for the moment the headmistress wishes you stay where you are." "Very well, Miss Honey," Matilda said. "Thank you so much for getting me these books." What a nice child she is, Miss Honey thought. I don't care what her father said about her. She seems very quiet and gentle to me, and not a bit stuck up in spite of her brilliance. In fact, she hardly seems aware of it. So when the class reassembled, Matilda went to her desk and began to study the textbook on geometry which Miss Honey had given to her. The teacher kept half an eye on her at all times, and noticed that the child very soon became deeply absorbed in the book. She never glanced up once during the entire lesson. Miss Honey, meanwhile, was making another decision. She was deciding that she would go herself and have a secret talk with Matilda's mother and father as soon as possible. She simply refused to let the matter rest where it was. The whole thing was ridiculous. She couldn't believe that the parents were totally unaware of their daughter's remarkable talents. After all, Mr. Wormwood was a successful motor car dealer, so she presumed that he was a fairly intelligent man himself. In any event, parents never underestimated the abilities of their own children. Quite the reverse. Sometimes it was well it was impossible for a teacher to convince a proud father or mother that their beloved offspring was a complete nitwit. Miss Honey felt confident that she would have no difficulty in convincing Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that Matilda was something very special indeed. The trouble was going to be stopping them from getting over-enthusiastic. And now Miss Honey's hopes began to expand even further. She started wondering whether permission might not be sought from the parents for her to give private tuition to Matilda after school. The prospect of coaching a child as bright as this appealed enormously to her professional instinct as a teacher. And suddenly she decided that she would go and call on Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that very evening. She would go fairly late, between 9 and 10 o'clock, when Matilda was sure to be in bed. And that's precisely what she did. Having got the address from the school records, Miss Honey set out to walk from her own home to the Wormwoods' house shortly after 9. She found the house in a pleasant street, where each smallish building was separated from its neighbors by a bit of garden. It was a modern brick house that could not have been cheap to buy, and the name on the gate said Cozy Nook. Nosy Cook might have been a better, Miss Honey thought. She was given to playing with words in that way. She walked up the path and rang the bell, and while she stood waiting she could hear the television blaring inside. The door was opened by a small, ratty-looking man with a thin, ratty mustache who was wearing a sport coat that had orange and red stripe in the material. "Yes?" he said, peering out at Miss Honey. "If you're selling raffle tickets, I don't want any." "I'm not," Miss Honey said, "and please forgive me for butting in on you like this. I am Matilda's teacher at school, and it is important. May I have a word with you, please?" "Got into trouble already, has she?" Mr. Wormwood said, blocking the doorway. "Well, she's your responsibility from now on. You have to deal with her." "She's in no trouble at all," Miss Honey said. "I have come with good news about her. Quite startling news, Mr. Wormwood. Do you think that I might come in for a few minutes and talk to you about Matilda? We are right in the middle of watching one of our favorite programs, Mr. Wormwood said. This is most inconvenient. Why don't you come back some other time? Miss Honey began to lose patience. Mr. Wormwood, she said, if you think that some rotten TV program is more important than your daughter's future, then you ought not be a parent. Why don't you switch off the darn thing and listen to me? That shook Mr. Wormwood. He was not used to being spoken to in this way. He peered carefully at the slim, frail woman who stood so resolutely out on the porch. Very well, then, he snapped. Come on in and let's get it over with. Miss Honey stepped briskly inside. Mrs. Wormwood isn't going to thank you for this, the man said, as he led her into the sitting room, where a large platinum blonde woman was gazing rapturously at the TV screen. Who is this? The woman said, not looking around. Some school teacher, Mr. Wormwood said. She says she's going to talk to us about Matilda. He crossed the TV set and turned it down, but left the picture on the screen. Don't do that, Harry, Mrs. Wormwood cried. Willard is just about to propose to Angelica. You can still watch it while we're talking, Mr. Wormwood said. This is Matilda's teacher. She says she's got some sort of news to give us. My name is Jennifer Honey, Miss Honey said. How do you do, Mrs. Wormwood? Mrs. Wormwood glared at her and said, What's the trouble, then? Nobody invited Miss Honey to sit down, so she chose a chair and sat down anyway. This, she said, was your daughter's first day at school. We know that, Mrs. Wormwood said, ratty about missing her program. Is that all you came to tell us? Miss Honey stared hard into the woman's wet gray eyes, and she allowed silence to hang in the air until Mrs. Wormwood became uncomfortable. Do you wish me to explain why I came? She said. Get on with it, then, Mrs. Wormwood said. I'm sure you know, Miss Honey said, that children in the bottom class at school are not expected to be able to read or spell or juggle with numbers when they first arrive. 5-year-olds cannot do that. But Matilda can do it all. And if I am to believe her, I wouldn't, Mrs. Wormwood said. She was still ratty at losing the sound on the TV. She was lying then, Miss Honey said, when she told me that nobody taught her to multiply or read. Did either of you teach her? Teach her what? Mr. Wormwood said. To read. To read books, Miss Honey said. Perhaps you did teach her. Perhaps she was lying. Perhaps you have shelves full of books all over the house. I wouldn't know. Perhaps you are both great readers. Of course we read, Mr. Wormwood said. Don't be so daft. I read the auto car and the motor from cover to cover every week. This child has already read an astonishing number of books, Miss Honey said. I was simply trying to find out if she came from a family that loved good literature. We don't hold with book reading, Mr. Wormwood said. You can't make a living from sitting on your fanny and reading storybooks. We don't keep them in the house. I see, Miss Honey said. Well, all I came to tell you is that Matilda has a brilliant mind, but I expect that you knew that already. Of course I knew she could read, the mother said. She spends her life up in a room buried in some silly book. But does it not intrigue you, Miss Honey said, that a little 5-year-old child is reading long adult novels by Dickens and Hemingway? Doesn't that make you jump up and down with excitement? Not particularly, the mother said. I'm not in favor of blue-stocking girls. A girl should think about making herself look attractive so she can get a good husband later on. Looks is more important than books, Miss Honey. Now look at me, Mrs. Wormwood said. Then look at you. You chose books. I choose looks. Miss Honey looked at the plain, plump person with a smug, suet pudding face who was sitting across the room. What did you say? She asked. I said, you chose books and I chose looks, Mrs. Wormwood said. And who's finished up the better off? Me, of course. I'm sitting pretty in a nice house with a successful businessman, and you're left slaving away, teaching a lot of nasty little children the ABCs. Quite right, Sugarplum, Mr. Wormwood said, casting a look of such simpering sloppiness at his wife that it would have made a cat sick. Miss Honey decided that if she was going to get anywhere with these people, she must not lose her temper. "I haven't told you all of it yet," she said. "Matilda, so far as I can gather at this early stage, is also a kind of mathematical genius. She can multiply complicated figures in her head like lightning." "What's the point of that when you can buy a calculator?" Mr. Wormwood said. "A girl doesn't get a man by being brainy," Mrs. Wormwood said. "Look at that film star, for instance," she added, pointing to the silent TV screen where a bosomy female was being embraced by a craggy actor in the moonlight. "You don't think she got him to do that by multiplying figures, do you? Not likely. And now he's going to marry her, you see if he doesn't, and she's going to live in a mansion with a butler and lots of maids." Miss Honey could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had heard that parents like this existed all over the place, and that their children turned out to be delinquents and dropouts, but it was still a shock to meet a pair of them in the flesh. "Matilda's trouble," she said, trying once again, "is that she's so far ahead of everyone else around her that it might be worth thinking about some extra kind of private tuition. I seriously believe that she could be brought up to university standard in 2 or 3 years with the proper coaching." "University!" Mr. Wormwood shouted, bouncing up in his chair. "Who wants to go to university, for heaven's sake? All they learn there is bad habits." "That's not true," Miss Honey said. "If you had a heart attack this minute and had to call a doctor, that doctor would be a university graduate. If you got sued for selling someone a rotten second-hand car, you'd have to get a lawyer, and he'd be a university graduate too. Do not despise clever people, Mr. Wormwood. But I can see that we're not going to agree. I'm sorry to burst in on you like this." Miss Honey rose from her chair and walked out of the room. Mr. Wormwood followed her to the front door and said, "Good of you to come, Miss Hawks, or was it Miss Harris?" "It's neither," Miss Honey said, "but let it go." And away she went. And that's the end of our reading of Matilda for tonight. I was a little longer than I expected. I was 22 minutes. I thought we'd be closer to 15 or 16. Um, but we did get to know more about Miss Honey. We didn't get to interact too much with Matilda, and we definitely got to meet um, the headmistress, so the Trunchbull. And let's have a great conversation about all our new characters in the comment section.